Hey everybody, this is me, Mr. Clapp, explaining the phases of the moon. Now, with any astronomical phenomenon that we can view from Earth, I think it's important before we talk about why they happen is to talk about what we actually see. Before we get to the moon revolving around the Earth and angles with the sun and all of the explanation for the phases of the moon, we're going to start by explaining what a good caveman would have known or what we can see from the Earth. So not the explanations we finally figured out, but just what we actually see. We're going to start from there. So the phases of the moon, of course, change. One of the most interesting things about the moon from an observable standpoint for any kid is when you look up at the moon, it doesn't always look the same to you. Sometimes you see a bright big full moon, sometimes you see a moon that's far less. And this is what I want to explain right now. So again, it changes from one day to the next in terms of what we see. Every 29 and a half days, the moon makes a complete cycle. It cycles from a moon we can't see at all to a completely full moon and then back again. So here in this video, you see a moon going through its phases. And this again takes about 29 and a half days for it to go from nothing we can see at all to completely full and back again. And we have names for each of these phases as well. So I'm going to pause it and talk about the different names for the phases. And I'm going to start with the moon that we can't see at all. What we call this phase of the moon, where we can't see it at all, is a new moon. From here, the moon starts to become more visible. This is sort of a good place to start, of any, in our 29 and a half day cycle. So what the moon does from here is it starts to become visible, and we see this tiny, tiny little sliver. This part of the moon where we see less than half of the moon is called a crescent. And so a crescent, again, is this nice fingernail-looking sliver of a moon that's less than half full. The moon at this point is also getting bigger. In other words, the part that we can see is more and more visible. The crescent's getting bigger. We call the process of getting bigger or showing us or revealing more of the moon waxing. So this type of a moon that we see right after a new moon is called a waxing crescent. And so waxing because it's showing more and more every day, and crescent because it's less than half full. And as we keep on going, we'll see it continues to wax until we get to the point where it's half full. And this is about a week after the moon was new. And at this point, we see half of the moon, and we call this a first quarter moon. It's the first quarter of the cycle that's over, even though we see half of a moon. I know that can sometimes be confusing. So you can refer to this either as a first quarter or a waxing quarter, but this is a first quarter moon. At this point, the moon continues to wax, but now we're seeing more than half of the moon. So we're seeing all but a sliver. And at this point, we call it a gibbous. And a gibbous moon is more than half full. This is a waxing gibbous because it's still in the process of getting bigger. And it continues growing, of course, until it gets completely full. And I think you all know the term we use for that, which is a full moon. And so once the moon gets to here, it's what we call a full moon. We can see the entirety of it, and it's about 2 weeks, just a little longer than when the moon was new. So when we couldn't see anything. And this is a beautiful full moon. At this point, days after the full moon, you start to see the moon begin to do what we call wane. In other words, it starts to disappear a bit. So here we have yet another gibbous moon, still more than half full, but this gibbous moon is waning. We're seeing less of the moon over time. So this is a waning gibbous. And it continues to be a waning gibbous until it's half full, at which point we call it a third quarter moon. Notice it's the other half of the moon that's visible to us. But again, this is 3 weeks after, just about 3 weeks after we had a new moon, and we see half of the moon again. This continues, the moon continues to wane, but as a crescent. So this phase here is what we would call a waning crescent. Again, getting smaller and smaller, and it's showing again that sliver of the moon. And it will wane away as a crescent until we get to the point where there's no moon at all, and we once again call that a new moon. And those are the phases of the moon. Then it starts the process all over again happening about every 29 and a half days.